Welcome to the Deep Dive, ready to unpack another stack of sources.
Absolutely. Today, we're jumping into a really compelling collection. It's mostly excerpts from a text called El Caballero Templario, which gives these incredibly specific, sort of personal glimpses. Plus, we've got a helpful definition from Wikipedia about Turcopoles.
Right. And our mission for this deep dive, it's really about going beyond the big battles and the usual Crusades narrative. We want to dig into these sources and find those surprising human-scale details. What was life actually like?
Exactly. How did conflict really play out for the people caught up in it, whether they were on opposite sides or living inside these really strict places like convents or the Templar order or navigating all the political maneuvering.
Yeah, so get ready for some insights that might make you see this whole medieval period a little differently.
Definitely.
Okay, let's jump right in then, because the sources, they pull us into this scene almost immediately that, well, it really humanizes the conflict, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. You've got this Templar soldier interacting with a Muslim sergeant, and they're dealing with something as mundane as food, specifically, navigating religious dietary laws, the whole issue of pork, impure meat.
It's such a simple moment, but it says so much. The Templar, Arn, he sees some smoked meat with the Sergeant Yusuf and points it out.
And Yusuf reacts instantly.
Clearly embarrassed, right? Because it's pork, and he knows he's just contaminated their other food supply.
And Arn's response is, well, it's fascinating. He just apologizes, shrugs, and says something like, what's impure meat for one in this world is good meat for the other. It immediately signals these aren't just faceless enemies.
Right. They're individuals trying to get by in a shared reality, and Yusuf, he understands the contamination, but he whispers to his companions, quoting the Quran, actually, about how in times of distress, far from home, the rules aren't quite the same. It's this pragmatic acceptance based on their own faith. What really struck me, though, was the Templar's knowledge. He's not just speaking Arabic. He understands their customs. He even, references their sacred texts.
Yeah, and he explains it's not that unusual. He learned Arabic living in Palestine for 10 years. Says many Templars who work closely with locals speak it. His own sergeant, Armand, is new and doesn't get it, which kind of highlights how specific Arn's experience is.
And that depth of knowledge, it really sets the stage for that incredible exchange that follows, doesn't it?
It really does. Yusuf is genuinely surprised by Arn's Arabic and his grasp of the Quran.
He actually says Arn's knowledge of God's words is really great, but you can almost feel the weight of the question coming,
Exactly. Arn, maybe a little too confidently, replies, yes, one must know the enemy.
And that's the opening.
That's when Yusuf hits him with that crucial counterpoint. He says, well, if you speak like this, citing texts sacred to me, how can you be my enemy? And then he pushes, asking, what did Jesus say about holy war? Did Jesus say a single word about going to paradise if you killed me?
Oof. And the source notes, for the first time, the Templar shows this slight insecurity. Like he knows Yusuf has kind of cornered him. It just completely cuts through the simplified religious war narrative.
Yeah, it forces this reflection on the actual teachings of their faiths versus, well, their actions on the ground. It shows that even between enemies, there could be these moments of intellectual, even theological engagement, pushing each other.
Even while acknowledging they both want to win, and it feels like this eternal war.
Right, but they can still have that kind of exchange. And that thread of mutual respect, it pops up again later, doesn't it? With Saladin honoring Arn with that huge 1,000-horse escort, way more than usual for his rank.
Yeah, it suggests that competence or maybe character or even these moments of unexpected understanding could earn respect across enemy lines, even in such a brutal conflict.
It's just a powerful reminder. History isn't only about armies clashing. It's about these individual human interactions happening within that whole bigger picture.
Okay, let's shift gears completely now from the battlefield. Let's step into a very different world the sources show us. The Goodham Convent. It might seem rigid, quiet.
But it's anything but simple, right? The sources show it's full of life, actually.
Yeah, it's described with this really strict daily routine. Multiple singing times 7 or 8 a day, the midday meal, the prandium, after the 6th hour, usually just bread and pulmontaria, like a soup to dip the bread in.
And all eaten in silence while someone reads to them? Sounds intense.
Incredibly structured. But, the sources immediately show how the individuals within that structure find ways to, well, navigate it, or even subtly resist. You see this contrast between Cecilia Rosa acting weak, low voice, head down.
Yeah, sort of submissive. Versus Cecilia Blanca, who responds with her head held high, a voice that's maybe too high, but she's careful with her words, right, to avoid actual trouble.
Exactly. And their shared quiet rebellion, finding ways to annoy those singing times. The source says, the two friends acquired with time great skill in achieving, to annoy the 7 or 8 singing times of the day. It's small, but kind of significant in a place like that.
And within that rigidity, there's this incredibly deep friendship between them. Cecilia Rosa and Cecilia Blanca, they found hidden spots, like by a fountain, to embrace and kiss as if they had been free women.
The source points out how risky that was, how costly it would be if they were caught. They really risked a lot for that connection.
It sounds like it was their lifeline. They knew everything they needed to know without speaking, it says, and they needed that support because they faced real external pressures, too. They're praying daily for victory in this political conflict, the Folkung versus Eric factions.
Because their own fate was tied to it, right?
Yeah.
Cecilia Blanca is pretty pragmatic if the other side won. Peace might mean arranged marriages, and they feared being married off to old men. A fate she calls unfortunate, but maybe better than staying under Mother Rikisa's scourge.
And the danger felt very real. They hear enemy riders outside the walls, demanding their surrender, calling them the two whores of the Folkum. It brings the outside world right to their doorstep.
Wow. And then there's Mother Rikisa. She's getting urgent messages. There's this unexpected communion suggesting something big is happening. And she gets this new task, get the maidens making mantles.
Which seems so practical, almost mundane for a convent. The sources bring in Ulfhilde, a young, skilled weaver who suggests mixing linen and wool.
And Rikisa's secret goal with this project, to try and ease the hostility among the maidens through this shared work. She's surprisingly patient, even lets them chatter and laugh loudly in the workshop, which is described as almost indecorous.
Yeah, but she allows it, given the circumstances. But alongside all this daily life and external pressure, the sources reveal these really personal secrets and struggles.
Right.
Like Sister Leonore.
Right, she's broken her vow of chastity, pregnant by a Cistercian monk, Brother Lucian.
She's described as distressed, weeping, tormented by her sin. But at the same time, she clings to this belief that the Virgin Mary protects them and that the love she shares is this wonderful gift that makes life worth living. It's such a powerful mix of guilt and, well, human feeling.
And Cecilia Rosa has her own burden, her greatest sin, loving her betrothed Arne in flesh before they were fully married in God's eyes. 20 years of penitence for it, and she still questions why that felt so unforgivable.
Her focus is totally external now, though. Her prayers are all for Arne and their son Magnus. Seeing Arne return is her only hope, her salvation from what she calls the icy hell of Gudum and Mother Rikisa's torment.
And that depth of connection shows up again with Ulfhilde, the young weaver. When there's a possibility her life might change, she just breaks down, tears up at the thought of leaving Cecilia Rosa alone with the witch Rikisa.
And Cecilia Rosa feels that too, struggles with her own selfishness, admitting internally she can't bear losing another friend. So, yeah, convent life wasn't just prayer and rules. It was this complex little world of relationships, defiance, hidden pain, deep friendships, and surprising pragmatism, too.
Okay, so from the convent, let's move to another highly structured, intense place, the Knights Templar, living under the white mantle. The sources give us a really strong sense of their daily reality.
Ooh, it was incredibly demanding, guided by their strict code, the Norma. The sources detail this intense physical strain, hard rides, extreme heat, like riding 11 hours on one of the hottest days, pushing their horses until their muscles trembled.
And the Norma applied to the horses too, it seems. The expectation was just constant endurance, never abandoned, fulfilled orders, endured what no one else was capable of enduring. It really paints a picture of relentless discipline.
Yeah, and their headquarters, the Templum Salomonis in Jerusalem, is described as this huge, almost labyrinthine place. Corridors, rooms, patios with fountains, interestingly entered from a back door, giving it a slightly private, maybe secretive feel.
But inside, the main hall sounds like a real hub. Saracen carpets, long rows of desks, different groups working, faith watchers in green, workers in brown, knights in white, writing, reading, meeting foreigners.
And then set apart, behind white bars, is the sacred area, the large rotunda, high dome, the spiritual core of the order.
The process of joining, even for someone like Arne's Sergeant Armand de Gasconge, sounds incredibly serious. The sources really emphasize the preparation questions.
Yes, and they sound very pointed. Are you sound in body and health? And crucially, have you paid gold or silver? Or has anyone promised to make you one of us in exchange for a reward? They're directly tackling simony, buying office.
Right. The Norma explicitly states that if simony is discovered later, you lose the white mantle. They wanted that crystal clear up front.
It sounds like those initial questions were the real test, even more than the formal ceremony later. After this preparation, Arn tells Armand he'll be admitted as a knight soon, and he becomes confiloniero, the standard bearer, a position of honor.
And the Templars were, well, way more than just knights, weren't they? The sources reveal this huge economic power and reach.
Oh, yeah. A massive merchant navy, hundreds of ships operating across the Mediterranean.
Major players in trade, connections to Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and they facilitated inland connections too, using Bedouins and camel caravans to link places like Pisa and Mecca.
And their most important product, sugar. Cultivated, refined in Tiberias, shipped from ports like Gaza, sold for silver to European princes. It just shows how deeply embedded they were in the whole economy of the region.
The sources also show them taking on civil roles, legal roles. Arndt is described holding a majlis, like a council, mediating disputes, judging criminals alongside a physician.
Right, Uthman ibn Khattab. And there's that powerful example of the Palestinian peasant who finds his wife committing adultery, but brings her for judgment under Gaza's laws, which he swore to obey for security, instead of, exercising his religious right to kill her. Shows how the legal structure could sometimes override tradition.
And speaking of the military side, the sources mentioned the Turcopoles. We pulled up that Wikipedia definition you included.
Exactly. These were locally recruited, mounted archers, light cavalry, literally sons of Turks. They're pretty common, used by both the Byzantines and the Crusader States. The Templars and Hospitallers had high-ranking officers called Turcopoliers for coastal defense, and the king in Jerusalem had his own King's Turcopoles.
It just adds another layer to what these armies look like, right? Not just European knights, but despite all this structure and capability, the sources are really clear about the harsh realities of battle, terrible losses.
Yeah, the defeat at Marjayon is called one of the worst catastrophes for them. The numbers are stark. Out of 40 knights and 100 sergeants who went out from Gaza, only 2 knights and 53 sergeants came back, left them feeling this incomprehensible injustice.
And their own rules had brutal consequences here. The Templar norma, forbidding rescue if captured.
Which basically made captured Templars worthless to Saladin for exchange. The sources say he preferred decapitating them because they were seen as the best Christian fighters. It's a rule that literally cost them their lives.
Grim. Grandmaster Odo de Saint-Amand was captured there, died in captivity soon after.
Even Harold Eystein, the Viking fighting with them, makes this dark joke about being used to defeats back in Norway as a Birkbeinar, and how that experience was proving unexpectedly useful in the Holy Land. It just shows the Templars were this complex, multifaceted group war, trade, law, living under this incredibly demanding code where the rules really were life and death.
And all of this was happening within this incredibly volatile political scene in the Holy Land. The sources actually argue that the real disaster wasn't necessarily the battlefield losses, but that bad intentions back in Jerusalem caused the great defeat.
It sounds like a total hotbed of intrigue. You've got the young King Baldwin IV leprous, clearly not going to live long, and his mother, Agnes de Courtenay, wielding serious power behind the scenes.
And she's painted really negatively in these sources. Evil, a source of ruin, involved in infamous intrigues, unspeakable sins. Her power came through lovers and her brother.
Then there's Guy de Lusignan being pushed forward, but described pretty dismissively by some as a fop, a milksop. He's the one proposed to marry the king's sister, Sibylla.
And against them you have Count Raimundo of Tripoli, the regent. Experienced warrior, but deeply mistrusts the Templars because of that whole business with the assassins killing his father. He blames the Templars' alliance. He sees the court figures as rascals and vultures.
And just to add another layer of bitter conflict, the Templars and the Hospitallers apparently hated each other. Their Grand Masters, the sources say, wouldn't even speak.
Wow. It sounds incredibly fragmented, really personal. And the sources give us insight into how these rivalries played out. Raimundo is especially critical of the Templars, right? Accusing them of actively working against peace with Saladin.
Yeah, he points to their association with that notorious raider Reynold de Chatillon at Kerak as proof. He predicts Reynold will break the peace, which Raimundo believes the Templars increasingly evidently want.
But that view isn't universal. The sources contrast this with Arnaldo de Torocha, the Master of Jerusalem, later Grand Master. Even Raimundo, despite hating the order generally, sees Arnaldo as one of the few high-ranking Templars who actually gets that they need peace with Saladin.
He even has affection for Arnaldo, apparently. Views him as maybe the best of the few good Templars after meeting Arn. The sources kind of suggest that if fate allowed, Arnaldo should be the next Grand Master, since the current one is captured or dead.
It just really underscores how personal medieval politics was, driven by these deep grudges and power plays with potentially disastrous consequences for everyone. This mix of competing orders, secular lords, a weak court, just a recipe for instability. And yet, within all that instability and conflict, the sources show these surprisingly nuanced, almost pragmatic views on faith, coexistence, and, well, the nature of the war itself.
One that really stands out is from Arn, during a discussion maybe with some Cistercian monks. He argues the war isn't a law against God, but good against evil, because, as he puts it simply, it is the same God.
That's a pretty remarkable statement from a Templar Knight, isn't it? Especially in that context. It suggests a capacity for thinking beyond just simple religious divides.
And it kind of aligns with other details in the sources about the amount of cooperation across religious lines. It mentions Christians fighting for Saracens, but also many infidels fight on our side.
And it wasn't just on the battlefield. Non-Christian friends were vital for commerce, for caravans, even for espionage. And both Saracen and Jewish physicians were for Templars and secular lords.
It just paints this picture of a pragmatic reality on the ground. Survival, business, even basic healthcare meant people had to work together across religious lines. It really pushes back against that simplified idea of constant, pure religious warfare.
And Arn takes this pragmatism and turns it into this radical, strategic idea for keeping Jerusalem. He suggests allowing non-Christian prayer in the city to actually divide the Saracens and make their jihad, their holy war, impious.
Yeah, he specifically mentions letting Jews pray at the Western Wall, a place he admits he didn't even realize was sacred to Jews until he learned it from the physician, Musa ibn Maymun.
The strategy is incredibly counterintuitive, isn't it? What could be better than turning the jihad of our enemy into something unholy? By allowing religious freedom for others in Jerusalem, he thinks they undermine the whole religious justification for a Muslim holy war to liberate the city just for Islam.
And it's fascinating that Arnaldo de Corroja, the respected master, he agrees with this. He adds that what's really needed is peace with Saladin. And however painful it might be, sharing Jerusalem so all pilgrims, including Jews, have equal rights to the holy sites.
These pragmatic, almost radical ideas for coexistence just stand in such stark contrast to the other views we see, like the bishop arguing only the Holy Cross and a miracle can save them.
And tragically, the sources note that later, in the actual seat of Jerusalem, non-Christian prayer was prohibited, and those Saracen and Jewish doctors were forbidden to work for Christians. So that more tolerant, pragmatic vision, it didn't win out in the end.
These sources really do challenge that simple us versus them narrative. They show medieval figures, even Templar warriors, involved in complex cooperation and strategic thinking across religious lines for very practical reasons. Just a level of nuance we often lose. Okay, let's look at how some of the big leaders operated on this stage, especially during and after key moments. The sources give us a real sense of their personalities and the impact they had.
Yeah, they show us the aftermath of Acre's surrender to King Richard Lionheart. Saladin had lost that race against time to save the city, and his garrison inside gave up.
And Arn gets this incredibly difficult job, alongside Al-Aftal, going into the conquered city to finalize the harsh surrender terms Saladin's people had already agreed to.
And the terms were brutal. The city itself, a huge amount of gold, thousands of Christian prisoners, including specific knights, and the return of the Holy Cross. A really bitter pill for Arn and Al-Afdal to deliver back to Saladin.
And King Richard's behavior during these crucial talks is described with, well, a lot of contempt. He made Saladin's negotiators wait outside Acre's walls while he held jousting competitions.
Yeah, the sources say he did everything he could to show his contempt. He even directly mocked Al-Afdal, asking if he was a coward if he dared joust one of his knights.
Arn translates, and Al-Afdal, prompted by Arn, gives this clever comeback he'd rather take on 2 knights at once with his bow. Richard just ignored it, apparently. It really shows his arrogance, doesn't it? And maybe poor diplomatic skill.
And that arrogance wasn't just aimed at enemies. The sources have that other anecdote about Richard's awful relations with his allies. He kicked the French king, Philip Augustus, out of the Templar headquarters where he was staying over some petty argument,
leading Philip to just pack up and go home with all his troops. And Richard did something similar to the Austrian duke. Grabbed his banner, broke it, threw it in the moat.
Which sparked actual fighting between the English and Austrians, leading the Austrians to leave too. The source notes that through all this, the Christians lost half their troops. Yet Richard seemed to be seriously convinced that only he and his men, plus the Templars, were needed to retake Jerusalem, just a complete failure to grasp the need for unity.
And while Saladin delivered on some terms the gold, most prisoners he didn't hand over the 100 specific knights Richard demanded, saying he couldn't find them all. Richard used that as his excuse to break the agreement completely.
Which led directly to that horrific massacre outside Acre. Thousands of prisoners, men, women, children, just brought out and slaughtered by Richard's forces. It's such a stark example of how leaders' personalities, their arrogance, their petty fights, had immediate, brutal consequences for ordinary people.
And just to bring it back to that human scale we started with, the sources do follow the personal stories of some of these individuals we've met, showing us where they ended up and leaving some questions.
Yeah, we get that really powerful scene of Cecilia Rosa being released from the convent, pulling off her wimple after 20 years, feeling almost bald, shaking out her illegally long hair, looking for her reflection in the water.
Because convents had no mirrors, right? So she could only imagine her face, her red hair. She felt like she saw more of a memory of her younger self than who she was now. It's just so poignant thinking about all that lost time.
And her return to the world is this huge transformation. She becomes the mistress or ekonoma of Ofsham, insisting on the female title, a role that seems almost difficult for her to comprehend after being enclosed for so long.
She meets with Birger Brosa, talks about her 20 years in a cage, still praying for Arn and their son Magnus. Birger Brosa, of course, had taken Magnus as a baby, raised him as his own, with all the gossip about his real parents.
And Birger Brosa hints that, given the situation, Arn described as a warrior of God's grace might be needed back home soon. It ties Cecilia's uncertain future directly to Arn's potential return.
And we see Arn's story continue after a major battle, probably Hatton from the context. He suffers a severe leg injury.
But he's helped to recover, learned to walk again by that wise physician, Musa ibn Maymun. Their friendship deepens during this time. They have discussions that include Arn learning, much to his surprise, how sacred the Western Wall is to Jews.
Saladin gives Arn a simple, functional Templar sword as a gift, and Arn really values it, more than fancy ones, refuses to sell it, honoring the gesture.
His friend Fokker teases him about missing out on a fortune. And in this nice touch of humor and defiance, Arn writes this note mocking a little learned grandmaster, probably Gerard de Redfort, adding translations in French and Arabic because the guy didn't know Latin. Fokker thinks it's hilarious.
And Arn has another interaction with Yusuf, returning a favor, acknowledging God's guidance. Yusuf tells Arn he holds Jerusalem here in my fist, that it will fall soon after Ascalon and Gaza, but that he wants to win well and needed someone outside his own circle to discuss what was right.
Just reinforcing that complex, almost respectful relationship between them, even as Jerusalem's fall looms.
And finally, the sources capture that immense personal cost of war with the image of a Templar dying at Hatton, realizing his own selfishness in his last moments, praying for Cecilia and the child who would now be fatherless.
These individual stories, love, loss, resilience, those unexpected connections, they just show that despite the grand sweep of history, wars, politics, it's ultimately lived by people grappling with universal human stuff. Their fates are tied to these huge forces, but also shaped by their own relationships and choices.
Okay, what a deep dive into these sources. It really does peel back the layers on the medieval world, doesn't it? From figuring out dietary laws with someone you're supposed to see as an enemy,
to the hidden lives and quiet defiance in convents, and the complex economics of sugar for the Templars. It's just amazing detail.
We've definitely seen that the reality was far more nuanced, more human than the simple stories often suggest. Moments of surprising understanding, cooperation across religious lines.
Right alongside bitter internal conflicts and the brutal consequences of power wielded by leaders like Richard and Saladin.
And we got a real sense of the incredibly tough lives of the Templars under their norma, the hidden complexities within convent walls, and that cutthroat political maneuvering shaping everything.
And most importantly, I think we connected with individuals Arn, Yusuf, Cecilia Rosa, Ulfilde, Mus ibn Maymun. Their personal stories, their friendships, losses, hopes, they remind us history is fundamentally about people navigating their world.
So here's a final thought for you to maybe mull over, building on everything we've talked about. How do these glimpses into the pragmatic compromises, the unexpected alliances born from necessity, and the profound personal costs of conflict back then in the medieval period, how do they resonate with the challenges and complexities we still grapple with in our world today?
Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.